They probably have less command and control over the Houthis than any other partner or proxy group. The Shia militants in Iraq and Syria, however, are kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. There's probably no groups that Iran has better control over than those Shia militants. You have IRGC forces that are directly co-located with them, especially in Syria. And so a targeted attack that hits them could have a meaningful impact. In other words, especially if it ends up with the killing of IRGC officers.
President Joe Biden has said he has decided how the US will respond to a drone strike that killed 3 American troops in Jordan at the weekend. Mr. Biden didn't give details, but he made it clear he did not want a wider war in the Middle East.
Do hold them responsible in the sense that they're supplying the weapons to the people who did it.
Well, that was Joe Biden answering questions from reporters as he got on board his helicopter at the White House. Well, an Iran-backed militia group has claimed responsibility for the attack at a US military base near the Syrian border, which also injured 40 people, though Iran itself has denied any involvement in the attack. It's the first time US soldiers have been killed by enemy fire in the Middle East since the Israel-Gaza war erupted on the 7th of October. So how will the US respond? I've been speaking to Jonathan Panikoff. He's a former Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East at the National Intelligence Council and now Director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Middle East Programme.
There's really a range of options. It's not binary that you either strike Shia militant camps in Iraq or Syria, or strike Iran. I think there's a range of things that could happen. I think it's certainly very likely, if not probable, that you're going to see strikes against Syrian and Iraqi-based Shia militant camps backed by Iran and militants there. It's also possible that you could see an increase of non-lethal activity, sanctions, for instance, really be tightened. But I think the bigger question is going to be whether or not the president also decides that he's going to go after direct Iranian ships or infrastructure or weapon systems in Iran or off the coast. I think attacking an IRGC, a Revolutionary Guard ship, for instance, is probably certainly in the mix. I think it's possible you could see an attack on the Iranian homeland directly targeting military infrastructure, but that, in my mind, I think becomes less likely in terms of a range of options.
Yes, I mean, President Biden has made it clear that he does blame Iran for arming those responsible for this attack, even though Iran itself has said it's not responsible. I mean, if the United States were to strike directly at Iran on its territory, I mean, that potentially opens up a direct conflict between the United States and Iran, doesn't it?
I think it certainly would. And I think the second part of President Biden's statement, which I also think is really important, was a very direct disclaimer that he's not looking for escalation in the region. The U.S. has really been the leader in trying to ensure that the conflict doesn't escalate beyond Israel and Hamas and Gaza. Obviously, I think it's questionable whether that's really possible anymore. It seems that we're in a bit of a different place. But there's a difference between a direct Iran-US war that I really don't think the US wants, and I certainly don't think Iran wants, versus more regional escalation, even if it goes up in the coming days and weeks.
Isn't the problem with striking at some of these militia groups, though, that, as we've seen with the Houthis in Yemen, far from deterring them from further attacks, if anything, it emboldens them. They are almost reveling in this position of being at the forefront of this resistance to what is happening between the Israelis and Hamas in Gaza, taking on the West almost.
I think there's an important distinction to be made, frankly, between the Houthis and the Shia militants vis-a-vis Iran. The Houthis have their own agenda. They have their own capabilities. They're certainly reliant on Iran for targeting and they have a good partnership. But the Houthis go their own way and really have their own agenda. And Iranian command and control over the Houthis is not very good. In fact, they probably have less command and control over the Houthis than any other partner or proxy group. The Shia militants in Iraq and Syria, however, are kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. There's probably no groups that Iran has better control over than those Shia militants. You have IRGC forces that are directly co-located with them, especially in Syria. And so a targeted attack that hits them could have a meaningful impact. In other words, especially if it ends up with the killing of IRGC officers, I think then you could have a more meaningful impact. But it is true, at the end of the day, this is the balance the U.S. has to strike. What level of attack is needed to restore deterrence? Deterrence isn't a one-time thing. This isn't going to be a one-day issue. I think it's going to have to be constant pressure. And so the question is going to be, how do you start it? When the response happens, is it just with Shia militants, or do you actually do something that's perhaps up the escalatory ladder, like striking a direct IRGC or Iran target, shipping target, for instance, in order to really try to say, this is not acceptable. We're telling you to stop. If you don't, there's going to be a bigger problem.
And we heard from Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, yesterday saying that it could be a sustained response. It might not just be a one-off.
Well, I think that's right. And I think that's because deterrence isn't just a one-off. It can't just be one day of strikes and that's going to reset it. Remember, the Houthis had launched over 150 strikes before the U.S. actually made a decision to get an international coalition together and to try to respond. I think there's a view that the U.S. really was as patient as it possibly could. And I think the Biden administration deserves credit for that, trying to prevent regional escalation. But at some point, if it's the strikes are going to keep happening and you don't respond, I think it actually invites further strikes that create greater dangers to our allies. The game changer here isn't just because of the tragic loss of life of 3 U.S. service members. The game changer is also that this strike happened in sovereign Jordanian territory, a critical U.S. ally where there are no Shia militant camps, when there is no Shia militias under Iranian influence. It came over the border, and that matters just as much.
Why do you think we have seen this attack on that base in Jordan right now? It's a base that's been there for some time. We do hear that there was some confusion about the incoming drones and that perhaps the US didn't respond swiftly enough to save the lives on the ground. But why do you think the militia group chose this moment to strike into Jordanian territory?
I think that's a question that we're going to have to take a little bit of time and really work through. I'm not sure anybody has a good answer. The reason I say that is because, there's two real possibilities. One is that the militants assume that U.S. air defenses, which are actually excellent in the area, would work. It just happened to be a fluke that because of the U.S. drone in the area, they did not. And so you saw this tragic loss of life. And so they didn't think it would be escalatory. They thought it would be more symbolic, or at least in line with previous efforts to attack the U.S. The second is that they did think it would work or hope that it would work. And the result was exactly what they wanted. Either way, it moves us up the escalatory ladder. And I think the reason that it actually happened is probably less important than how the U.S. responds and what that means in terms of how do we properly calculate to ensure that we respond in a way that's going to deter the Iranians from allowing this type of attack while not leading to a broader Iran-U.S. or region-wide conflict.
We are in an election year. We've already had Donald Trump saying that he believes these attacks only happened because of President Biden's weakness. We've got Republican senators urging strikes on Iran itself. How much difference do you think it makes to President Biden's decision and the pressures on him that he is, it seems very likely, going to be confronting Donald Trump in that presidential campaign later this year?
Honestly, I don't think it makes much of a difference at all. To President Biden's great credit, whether you agree with his strategy when it comes to Ukraine, whether you agree with his strategy when it comes to how he's dealt with the Israel-Gaza conflict, even if it's cost him political points and political challenges, including on the left of his own party related to the Israel-Gaza conflict, I think we've seen a president who's reflected true U.S. leadership, to be totally honest, which is he's putting the country first, he's putting policy that he thinks is correct first. I have no doubt that President Trump will try to take advantage of it. I've got no doubt Republicans in Congress will try to take advantage of it. And for some of them, including folks like Senator Graham and Senator Cotton, I think it's a truly held belief. I don't think it's just about political points. I think they view President Biden's policies as having been incorrect on this. But I don't imagine that it's going to actually have a huge impact, at least at this point, on how President Biden chooses to respond.
Well, that was Jonathan Panikoff, former Deputy National Intelligence Officer at the US National Intelligence Council, speaking to me just a little earlier here on Times Radio.